Hello, my name is Lee Presser. This is my show. I speak frequently to very interesting people. Some of these conversations are so exciting, so intellectually stimulating, I thought others might like to listen in. This is the reason we started recording Conversation with Lee Presser.
Welcome to Conversation with Lee Presser. Wikipedia defines journalism as an activity or product of journalists or others engaged in the preparation of written, visual, or audio material intended for dissemination through public media with reference to factual ongoing events of public concern. It is intended to inform society about itself and to make events public that would otherwise remain private. According to the book, The Elements of Journalism, the essence of journalism is to provide citizens with reliable information through the discipline of verification. Unfortunately, in recent years, the news business has lost its tight grip on the verification process. Here to talk about the current state of journalism is David Sheets, Regional Director for the Society of Professional Journalists. Mr. Sheets, now an independent media consultant, spent 25 years in the newspaper business, including 7 years as a writer and editor for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. He is currently on the board of the St. Louis Media Hall of Fame and is an advisor for the student newspaper at Webster University. David Sheets, welcome to Conversation.
Thank you very much.
So, okay, you heard all that I had to say, especially about that verification process. But before we go into that, you've been in the newspaper business 25 years. What is your opinion of what it was you were doing as a journalist and those around you at whatever paper you're working at?
I think the opinion was that your first priority was to not just get the facts of a particular situation or story, but also make sure that you were interpreting those facts correctly, because you're dealing with such a broad audience. Newspapers try to reach out to as many people as possible, and that they don't actually deal with the diversity of that audience quite as well as perhaps the online world does today. So you tried to reach out to as many people as possible and be as clear about the news as possible so that people could make an informed decision about the information that was coming before them, and use that information to make reasoned judgment about the things that they needed to do in their lives.
Clear, that's a very important point that you just made there. All too often, I will read newspapers and go through the first 2, 3, 4 paragraphs and say, what is this about? I'm sorry, I'm missing something here. You know, they're quoting people and all this emotion and a lot of heat, very little light. Then finally, somewhere down there, it's like, okay, now I know what they're talking about. Mm-hmm. When you started in the newspaper business, was that the methodology that you had been taught, is to bring in all these people and their quotes at the top? Or was it, here's the situation, let me describe that, this is what we're going to be talking about, and then move down into the article?
It usually depended upon the story. Certain stories and events would lend themselves to getting the expert opinion up higher into the story. And then other stories would lend themselves more to the facts of a circumstance. For instance, perhaps a house fire or a car accident. You wanted to get the facts of the story of what was going on, who was affected, how it affected other people, before you would get to the professionals involved. Politics was another matter. Economics were other matters. Those stories would require more reasoned analysis, and it's the higher that you got that analysis up into the story, the more likely you could get the point of the story across clearer to people.
Well, I always thought the who, what, where, why, wasn't that what we were taught?
Yes, who, what, when, where, why, and how are the basic questions that you have to answer for readers and viewers. But there are also a couple other questions as well that are very important, which is who cares and so what? If you can't answer those questions as well and be able to determine whether the story means something to somebody, you might not be serving your audience quite as well as you should be.
What do you mean by that? I would like you to really speak to that point as to what you think that the journalist's role is in that very area.
Well, you have to understand that everyone can go to an event or see something happening in front of them and be able to recount events. To some degree, we all have that ability. It is in our nature so that we can communicate with other people. What a journalist tries to do is help explain why that is important to a broader audience and not just the person in front of them. So you have to understand who cares about a story like that. What people in the audience would be interested in that story. And the so what is, why does something like this even matter to me? Why does something like this even matter to the people in my readership area or my viewership area? Because if you don't really address the interests and the needs of people in relation to the information that's there, you lose your audience. And to some degree that has been the problem that newspapers and to some degree television stations have had over the past few years, is that they've been more interested in the marketing aspect, not necessarily in the informational aspect. And there has been some friction there, which has resulted in a loss of viewers and readers.
I agree. I've noticed that you mentioned television, which we haven't talked about yet. I've noticed, especially in television news, that it's mostly flashbang, that there seems to be very little story or background most of the time. If you watch, especially if you watch like the morning news, like this morning, you would watch the news and you'd see a lot of flashing police lights, you'd see fire trucks, you'd see smoke. How do you feel about being out of your house?
Mm-hmm.
You know? How do you feel about your child having fallen off the balcony? How do you feel about, your son's been murdered? How do you think I felt about that? Not good.
Mm-hmm.
And to have someone thrust a mic in front of you seems rather disingenuous, and I think that a lot of viewers really find that kind of disparaging.
It can be. But there are so many markets where you have increasing competition, and this is largely brought on by the internet. You would think that the competition is actually decreasing because of newspapers consolidating or shutting down and television stations having staff reductions. But in fact, because of the internet, the amount and the degree of competition is increasing. And so you have very many media, mainly digital, who are all vying for a fairly narrow audience, and they're elbowing each other to make sure that they get that attention. And one of the things that they use to try and get that advantage is the emotional aspect, to try and get that sense of shock that a person feels at the moment something happens to them, which is why you keep hearing this question, how did you feel when that happened? Because they're hoping to elicit an emotion from somebody that they can use to help sell that particular product that they have that day. And as we have more competition and as the digital world becomes even broader, I think we'll wind up seeing more and more of this.
I think that says something about the folks out there in television land too, as to what their expectations are about what the kind of information that they require and demand of journalists.
Mm-hmm.
Because let's face it, you can only sell what people are buying.
Right. And basic information by itself is not attractive. It's not sexy. It's not flashy. It's not fancy.
But it's important to the decision-making process in an organized society.
It is. But if everybody is quoting and reciting the same information over and over, it tends to get kind of mixed into this big morass of information, and people have trouble understanding it or discerning it. One approach is to use the emotion, to try and get that emotional impact and then drag people to the information. But there is a larger segment of media that is starting to realize that if you actually treat the audience with intelligence, don't go for the emotion, go for their sense of what is right and what is smart, then you will have just as much of an effect, and you will actually be able to make this information stick in their heads longer.
Is this why new media seems to be having a considerable impact on old media? And by new media, I'm talking about the ability of an individual such as yourself, a trained individual, to be able to get on the internet and provide content to a reader group, however big or small it is, as opposed to Channel 2, 4, 5, the Post-Dispatch, the Beacon, whomever?
It's a very big factor because now anybody can broadcast. They can, in a matter of minutes, piece together a video, write a story, and put it up online and ideally be seen by millions of people instantly. It used to be you had only certain media that allowed that. You had just the basic 3 networks. You had just the 1 or 2 newspapers. You had just a handful of radio stations. The market was very constricted, and the message came through that small constriction. Now everybody seems to think that they have the ability to do exactly the same thing. What we try to do with the Society of Professional Journalists is reinforce not just to journalists, but to a lot of the marketplace as well in media, that if you want to be responsible and if you want to be treated seriously, you have to treat information seriously. You have to treat the facts with respect. If you don't do that, your audience won't respect you.
You lived through the transition period of the Post-Dispatch from Pulitzer ownership to the new owners, and I'm blanking on their name right now.
Lee Enterprises.
Lee Enterprises, yes. What was that like?
Well, it came about the same time that many other newspaper companies were trying to change, either whether it was the way they delivered the news or their ownership or their management. It was coming at a large role in the change of media in this country. It was perceived as a very major change that everybody at the staff of the Post-Dispatch knew was going to change the way that they did things. What wasn't known was how. And then later, as the economy took a turn, then the factor of economics became much larger than ever before, at least larger than many of the people at the Post-Dispatch ever remember it being. And that became the driving force, and it certainly affected the way that they did their work, the way that the work was presented, the way that people were able to see this work being presented.
When you say the economy changed, are you referring to the fact that there were less advertising dollars available to the Post, or something else?
That, but also it was about that same time that digital media really started to experience a boom, and there were more media available to present information that the Post-Dispatch had been presenting and had been famous for presenting.
By digital media, you're referring to the internet and presentation on the internet as opposed to on broadcast television, right?
Exactly.
Right.
But also about the same time was the establishment of Facebook and Twitter and other social media platforms. About the same time that ownership changed at the Post-Dispatch. And some of these things started affecting the way people were getting their news and getting their daily information, and was actually taking away from the Post-Dispatch audience.
I just thought of this, and I don't know if you really want to talk about it, and if you don't, we won't. But what do you think about what happened to Larry Connors?
Well, I think when you use social media in any capacity, whether you're doing it as an individual or as a representative for any organization, whether it's a media organization or any other professional organization, you have to be very, very attentive to the message that you're trying to get across, the tone in which you're trying to get it across, the emotion with which you're using to get that message across, and your audience.
Let's just remind people what happened here. Larry Connors was an on-air personality for Channel 4 in St. Louis. He wrote something on their Facebook site. Is that
That's
right?
correct.
And he made some comment about being investigated or having to pay money to IRS. And this was in relation, I believe President Obama's name was mentioned in this article as well.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. And so as a result of whatever it was that he actually said there, management decided that they could no longer keep him on the air.
There were several decisions that were involved there.
I believe he's in the process of a lawsuit as well.
Yes, he is. Yes. And I think that that's evolved over time, that it became more than just what was being said in Facebook, that maybe there were some issues that Larry might have had with the station, and so that's where that case is right now. But the triggering effect was his statements on social media, and that he made an assumption, some people believed, that his professional relationship and his personal relationship were somehow being affected adversely. But he did not present any particular facts to back that up. And this is where people got really very upset with what he was saying, that it seemed like he was not being the kind of reporter he had been for many years and not backing up the information that he was generally reporting.
He was considered one of the premier reporters of the St. Louis region for several decades, wasn't it?
Exactly. And it somewhat goes to the point of where conjecture can get you into trouble if you're using a medium to present your message. No matter what it is you're trying to do, whether it's your opinion or whether it is actual straightforward information, it really helps your credibility, and in fact it will save you if you have the information to back up what you're saying and to be responsible with that information at all times.
Well, it used to be in journalism as well as in television news that there was no such thing as off the cuff. I mean, newspapers might put out an extra, but it had gone through the editing process, and all the editors agreed, okay, here's the story, here's the facts, here's how it all lines up. Right. Some guy just doesn't, and just boom, you know, it's out there, right? It used to be that there was a whole, as I recall from years ago, the Post was like, there would be a reporter like you who would write it, then there'd be a first line editor that would look at it, then it moved to a second line editor, and I think in the old days there was even a third guy that would take one last look at it before it went over to typesetting. Exactly. And because of economics, the third guy, second guy, I'm not even sure if the first guy's still in place anymore. Maybe people are editing their own.
Well, it depends. Sometimes you look at things online and they don't look like they've been edited. But what has carried over from the older media is that belief that being first is somehow also means that you're the best. Now, newspapers and television had these lines of editors because they could control when the information was actually released. They had time to actually edit it. But now with digital media being immediate, people are believing that if they can be first with information right now and get it out first right now, that they will somehow gain credibility. And they're losing that credibility because they're not backing up the information, something that those editors at those old newspapers and television stations and radio stations did for many years before that.
I agree. It used to be when you'd have to wait for Walter Cronkite or David or Huntley and Brinkley to tell you what the news was around the country.
Exactly.
At like 6:30 Eastern or 5:30 Central.
Yes.
And now people who are really into news, I already heard that story. I already read that story. I already know that. So this is all old information.
Exactly. And a perfect example of where things are going is the bombings in relation to the Boston Marathon, where people were actually watching the police in the pursuit of the suspects as it was happening through social media and various social media. And it actually put people literally hundreds of miles away, right there at the scene of the incident, and the police pursuit thereafter. That's a very powerful thing when you can do that. And media now, professional media has to adapt to that. That's not going away.
The flip side of that is when out in LA a number of years ago, helicopters started showing live police chases of characters who were doing something wrong and just simply wouldn't stop for the police. And while at first that was riveting and kind of cute and novel, it actually taught people in other parts of the country, well, I can get away with something. I can copy that, I can do that, I can run away from the police. And it seems to me that what has happened is that the media has almost become a training ground for some people to learn how to do bad things the right way.
Well, I guess you could do that, but I suppose that if you look back in the early 20th century, you had cities that had many competing newspapers, and they had many competing crime staffs, and that there were complaints even back then about how newspapers covered crime scenes, and alleging that they were revealing way too much, that these people could actually learn more about a crime than was necessary. We go through these troughs and peaks in media development over time, and we're in another one of those unstable areas where we're learning how to use the tools that we have and the response people have to our actions with them.
Oftentimes the Secretary of Defense of the United States might say the very same thing, that media is teaching the other side way too much.
That's something that you have to consider too. There is a safety factor, but truly one of the things that you must consider is that besides presenting the facts, is presenting perspective. If you can present information with perspective and do it in a safe manner, we're not hurting people. Then you are really truly serving the public. But that is possible, that you have people who are bad people, if you want to call them that, and they're watching what everybody else is doing through social media and other digital means, and they're using that as their guide.
But important stories, I mean, really important stories, sometimes I find really important stories and it's like the media just sort of peters out on it. For example, I mean, here, just so people know, today is September 24th, 2013, okay? And not that many weeks ago, the issue of the NSA spying on the American public, emails, et cetera, was like the largest story. Everybody's talking about it now. That's gone. Media doesn't talk about that anymore. And yet, probably the same thing's going on today that was going on, I mean, I'm talking about in terms of data collection systems, as was going on there. Nothing's been settled, but yet the media's moved on to the next series of stories.
Well, to some degree that story is still being covered. It's not as being covered quite like it was, because initially it was the shock value, as I mentioned earlier, that to hear that this was actually going on.
They're listening in, they're reading.
Or the presumption that this was going on.
Yeah.
Now is becoming what I would say, the more reasoned approach. We're doing the research, doing the analysis, finding out to what extent this was actually happening, whether it was done intentionally, whether it was even done in some instances by mistake. The analytical process does continue. It doesn't always continue with as much flash as the initial reporting, but there are still people looking into this.
Okay. Before we went on the air, I had mentioned the incident at the Navy Yard and the discussion in the press of, I believe that was before we went on the air. Sometimes I forget when these conversations occurred. But the AR-15, which wasn't there. The media latched on to the whole idea of that this shooter was using an AR-15. It was repeated and repeated and repeated. Finally by all of the electronic and print media, only to find out at the end of the day there was no AR-15. That's, and like in the introduction I said, verification has kind of broken down. What can we do, from a professional journalist point of view, what should be done in order to try to correct situations like that?
I think we'll have to actually not worry so much about being fast, but worry more about being right. You actually ideally try to do both, but of the two, you try to be accurate first. And if that means delaying, if that means waiting, if that means taking a few more seconds before you actually post something online, or a few more minutes to verify that information to be sure, I think that's going to have to be where more people focus their efforts. The response will be from the public that they're sick and tired of irresponsible reporting, and this will come back to hurt professional journalists. So the guiding force to good journalism is often the audience. If the audience responds loudly enough, journalism will follow. I think that's where we're going.
We got about 4 minutes left. I'd like to give you the opportunity to discuss anything that we haven't covered at this point, or talk about anything of interest that you have.
Right now, I guess I'm here basically as a representative of the Society of Professional Journalists. which is a national organization of about 8,000 members. It's professional journalists, educators, researchers, analysts, and the organization is basically a force for defending the First Amendment, the rights of journalists to pursue the news, access to government records, and the insistence that all of this information be presented in an ethical, responsible manner. This is where I feel the Society of Professional Journalists becomes more important now for exactly all of these reasons we've been discussing here. This is an organization that I feel is in the best position to try and help guide not just established journalists, but new journalists in understanding what it takes to actually do their job responsibly and not minimize the information that they have at the risk of minimizing themselves or their credibility. It's a struggle. I mean, we keep fighting these issues over and over again. But this has to be done because, as I pointed out before, the audience will determine the audience will determine who the best journalists and best information gatherers are. And the more accurate that you try to be, the more likely you will maintain that trust and that credibility of the audience.
Do you guys have face-to-face reasoned discussions about this, or you trade written material, or how does this discussion process flow?
We have both. We trade written material, we have conferences. I'm a regional director, which is an area that includes Missouri, Nebraska, Kansas, and Iowa. We have regional conferences once a year. The last regional conference was here in St. Louis. The next one will be in Kansas City next April. We also have training programs where we reach out locally to either universities or professionals to present programs to enlighten journalists and also the public on some of these issues. And we also have guidebooks and guidance tools to help. I am the editor of a book for freelance journalists that was put out by the Society of Professional Journalists. And this book basically instructs how freelancers, who may not have had journalism training, who may not have gone to journalism school, how they can do their job responsibly and be able to maintain their credibility.
Yeah, that was, I was just going to ask about that, and unfortunately we've got like about 45 seconds left.
That's
here. But I was going to ask if there is some attempt to try and get some of these youngsters who want to be journalists, who are already out there sending stuff out, get them some training as to how to do that, and you just said the answer is yes.
Yes. It's one of the things that I do. I'm a student and faculty advisor with the Webster Journal newspaper at Webster University. So I'm out there trying to make that point clear to new students right now.
Great. Thank you very much. I appreciate your being with us. To
Thank
my
you.
audience, I've been speaking with David Sheets. You've heard the conversation. We've had this very interesting discussion about the need for ethical standards for journalists, and this man is working in that area. We'll see you next time. Oh, don't forget, we're on YouTube, so if you want to see this again or show it to anybody, just go to YouTube. Thanks.